It's quite interesting that the title itself, Foster Parents, already engenders a heart response. It's an emotional title. And so a lot of these kinds of paintings, they were first started probably around the mid-1700s. The classic example of these kinds of images would be someone like Chardin. He did all sorts of images of children at the maid's knee in the kitchen, children playing cards, children blowing bubbles, birdcage ones, things like that. So he was doing that in about 1735, 1740, 1750. Beautiful, beautiful paintings, stunningly done. And they kind of set off a whole genre of that. There are, of course, also in the Dutch tradition, genre paintings, domestic paintings, little details that are on one level inconsequential. They're not big dramatic historic events. They're private events. They're family events. And the Dutch painters and the French painters found buyers because of that. Even if it wasn't a painting of your own kids, it evoked the family. And there's that kind of thing there. And the idea of the foster parent, of course, it's not surprising that Dickens became famous for his depictions of the poorhouse and those kinds of things, getting kids out of spaces back into homes or being looked after. And because in the poorhouses, those kids were used as workforces. So these would then be rescue kids on many levels. From where we don't know, but it kind of taps into a growing social consciousness. And the form of it, the artist has chosen very specific things that, like your grandmother points out, give you a sense of home, a simple home. This little portico, they're on the threshold, which is quite important because they're in I don't know, maybe it's the courtyard outside, maybe it's the front door, I'm not quite sure. Goes straight into what might be the parlour or the dining room. It's a small table there, I'm not sure. It's got a lot of legs, so maybe it's the dining room. And yes, I'm sure your anthropologist can give you all sorts of things about the actual costuming that may be date specific. It might be appropriate, or it might be anachronistic, I don't know. It might be from another time that they're displacing. But because it's so generic, it's not that specific. When Chardin was making his paintings of kids playing games, he used it as a wonderful excuse to play with composition. Because then you weren't distracted. Say it was a war painting or a big witness painting, these very dramatic sort of situations, there would be a whole other kind of compositional structure. When you have something like this, the focus is obviously in relation to what these two are doing together and this gesture. So not only do we have the idea of the foster children, but the foster children are caring for something else. And there's a play here between the structure of this, which clearly gives them a little portal. It's like an extra frame. The architecture frames the two of them. And then within that, there's this circular motion. Compositionally, there's a circular motion here, which of course, in a sense, spirals you down to the bird. In addition to that, there are structures. The artist is obviously playing with the structures of the cube. Look how this form mirrors that form, mirrors that, the smaller, bigger, bigger. And so then, in a sense, the idea is, well, that the house is also there, because the house is also that architectonic, rectangular form. The domestic side of things, the broom, the box of toys, nice little bit of light coming through. Quality of light is important, sets a kind of mood. It's not too gloomy. So you've got a range of things happening that support the intimacy of this little moment. And it's not just the depiction of the two kids and the bird, it's the way the image is structured. And it might do you well to look at some of those very strong precedents, because Chardin was an excellent painter. This painter would be working in the mode of. Okay, so there's nothing particularly new or inventive here. It's working with an established genre, and it's then just engaging it, and the artist knows there's going to be a public for this, because it's an emotional content. It's quite interesting how that little bit of light up there on the top of the portico creates a kind of a welcoming space into that. There's light that moves around the image. There's a little bit of a spiral that's in fact going on here. And that again leads you back to the bird. If you follow that and look at the way the ivy's been handled. So there's some quite strong basic compositional things that allow us to, well, we know exactly where we're meant to be looking. What you've got here, see where this thing is so thin? This is very thin painting here. So this would have been underpainting. It's not an important part of the painting. Very often when artists are working on an image, they put all their concentration in those areas that they want the viewer to look at. So the peripheral edge, you can see the canvas. See the canvas through the paint. It's sketched in, the artist knows there's enough here for you to know there are leaves and things, and then you move through, and then now start looking at how much more paint there is in the little girl's petticoat, or pinafore rather, the little boy, a little bit of light on his ear, and the detail increases. Here, the mark is rudimentary. Look at those leaves. There's hardly anything there. It's just the merest of evocations. But by the time you get into here, and as I say, the little boy's ear, it's precisely drawn. What's happening on his face, how his nose turns up, that he's actually holding a little bowl there. And even the quality of his little waistcoat. And the precision and the care that's been given to that little bird cage. I mean, that's a very fine line in there. So all of those things, the fact that there's more detail here, the fact that there's more paint, literally, will draw your eye in and focus you into that kind of space. The rest, the perspective's not quite great. It's formulaic. It's not been handled all that well. But look at it. Can you see where direction it's going? Where does it lead? Right to the place of interest. Okay, so that you watch things like that. You watch what artists do with perspective, because normally perspective is an arrow to the important thing. It's quite curious that there's eggs behind in the bowl. You know, I don't know quite what the artist was intending, because they're clearly going to eat those things. So maybe it's just a little echo of bird stuff. I don't know. Can't really see what the toys are in the box, but we certainly know they're there. Maybe that's a doll, I don't know. So a little bit different techniques. There's a little bit of scumbling technique going on here, which brings light to the little pinafore. A little bit of scumbling, see on the bird's wing, which just makes the bird's wing fleck. Same on the girl's hair. His cap, a little bit there. The rest is very thin. This is a lot of glazing work here. Glazing work pushes things back. That's all being glazed, being pushes back. And the opacity of the paint here creates these forms quite effectively on his knee, on his thing he's sitting on. Is that the step? That's the edge of the step, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. That's kind of interesting because and it may have changed over time, the relationship to the opacity of the paint and the transparency of the paint, because if you look at the thing from a distance, it looks like there are two blocks. In fact, it's the whole step. It's a single surface, and it's difficult to see that initially. So I took, that's a block of sunlight, not a real block. It's kind of interesting. That slightly shifts the mood, makes it slightly more together.